Hi guys, I'm going to talk about the article Research on Domestic Violence in the 1990s, Making Distinctions. So the article had two main themes. The first one was distinctions among types of domestic violence, and the second was issues of control. So it is estimated that about 2 million women in the U.S. are terrorized by husbands or male partners who use violence to control them. That was one of the first things that the article talked about, and I felt like, honestly, I thought there would be more than that. And I just thought that that number seemed low. But anyway, so there are four major patterns of partner violence that were talked about, and if you ever taken social justice, you probably reviewed these. The first one is common couple violence, second, intimate terrorism, third is violent resistance, and the fourth is mutual violent control. Then the article talked about three types of male batterers. The first is family only, which those batterers involve primarily common couple violence, and they're the least severe violence and the least likely to engage in psychological and sexual abuse. The second was generally violent antisocial, and the third was dysphoric borderline. The last two are both primarily intimate terrorism. Generally violent antisocial, they're going to be broadly sociopathic and violent, and then dysphoric borderline will be deeply emotionally dependent on their relationship with their significant other. So this is where my first discussion question is going to come in. So I found it really interesting that there was so much research and definition and distinction just on male batterers, but there was little to no talk about what types of female batterers we might see. That wasn't broken down in the article at all. The article literally said the three types of male batterers. So first, why do you think that is? Why do we think we're only talking about the male batterers? And then, do you think that women could actually just fall into these three categories? So think of female in your mind when you think about the family only, generally violent, antisocial, and dysphoric borderline. Do those fit? Should we have different categories for the women? And why do we think that we're not really talking about that? Then the article talked about same-sex relationships. So I think it's really important to note that there's much more research on violence in lesbian couples than there is research on violence in couples with two gay men. And the article said that the reason why this really is because women are playing such a major role in the research on domestic violence, which that makes sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to me that that would be the way that falls. So psychological abuse is a major difference with lesbian couples. The first thing with the psychological abuse is threats of outing, threats of outing her to her family, to her friends, to people who she's tried so hard to hide this from. And then another kind of threat that goes on there is friends and social workers, they're a lot less supportive, and that just goes along with the stereotype that only men can be partners that batter. So if you have two women, it's a lot less likely for someone to be supportive because they're seeing through that lens of, well, men are batterers, women aren't, when that's not the case. So then the article went into dating and courtship and cohabitation. There was a lot of data collected on this. It was mostly collected through social surveys and mostly addressed just common couple violence. So extensive literature on just that leads to a really rich source of theoretical insight into the nature of partner violence. They discovered that, this ties into my other discussion question. So the study discovered that cohabitating couples reported more violence than married couples and dating couples. So couple living together but not married, those groups showed the highest rates of reported violence, which was very strange to me. So I was just wondering, why do you think that is? Why do we think that cohabitating couples report more violence than the married couples or the dating couples? Just very interesting little thing to me. Gender. So most intimate violence perpetrators are male, and most of the violent resistance perpetrators are female. Gender symmetry, the article talked about how the causes of violence are not the same for men and for women, and most research studies just talk about why men are violent, and there's not that much research on why women might be violent, which again goes back to my first question, why is that? Why are we not looking at why women may show violence or how women may show violence? I feel like we still have that mindset, everybody does, that men are the batters. Now's a good time to throw this in here. I do want to say that this study is literally in the title you see from the 1990s. So that was a little while ago. There's going to be some change in data, change in public opinion, change in society view of this stuff. Just bear that in mind going forward. Race and ethnicity. Most research has been on black domestic violence couples versus white couples, with black couples showing higher rates of violence. The highest rate of intimate terrorism violence against women was actually reported among American Indians and Alaskan Natives, which was interesting to me. If I was gonna guess, I would assume probably African American, but that's not what it was. So even though black couples in the studies show higher rates of violence. So the article addressed two main questions in regard to race. The first was, can we identify social forces that shape the experiences similarly across subsets of minority groups? Common experiences being exclusion, discrimination, domination, immigration. Obviously, yeah, I would say that we could do that. And then, what are the unique ways in which each particular racial and ethnic group context shapes domestic violence, its consequences, and community responses to it? Then the article talked about global complexities. So there are definitely some barriers to addressing domestic violence on a global scale. So first one, major barrier to anything global that you're going to do is going to be language. So it's just now coming to be that studies from other countries are becoming available in English. Then the second thing is going to be variability in the incidence of partner violence in various countries. And then the last thing, literature is still developing that explores effects of war, internal conflict, and terrorism on matters related to partner violence. So really what this boils down to with me is just we're still trying to gain information. We're still trying to establish a dialogue and learn more about how domestic violence exists in other countries and in other parts of the world. Again, let's go back to the fact that this was like 20 some odd years ago, right? Math is hard. So this is a long time ago that this information in this article came around. I would say that we're a much more global society now. We have global economy, global this, global that, a lot more communication, a lot more information available. So in 1990, they were sending like faxes and stuff, and now we have Twitter and, you know, the internet on a much faster scale. So I would imagine that there's a lot more information now, that studies probably are more comprehensive if they were going to do a study right now. Again, just want to throw that in there because I think that it's really important when we're analyzing this article to note that there's been a lot of advance just in communication since this was written. Okay, so that was the first half of the article, and then they talked about the second theme, which was control. So generally, perpetrators of domestic violence are going to hold some measure of control over their partner. The types of control may vary among the different types of domestic violence, but perpetrator is going to hold the control. They're going to have the power. That's the whole point. There's two lines of analysis in the role of control in an intimate relationship. The first is the compensatory model. I don't know if I said that right. Individuals act to maintain a reasonable level of control in their lives, becoming more controlling of their partner when their level of control is threatened. So you don't want to lose control. You don't want to lose that safety, that safe level of control over your partner. And then the second is control identity and mastery identity. So these identities are explored in terms of their relationships to gender, gender identity, and controlling behavior in intimate relationships. Then the article went into coping with partner violence. In the 90s, the dominant view on women in abusive relationships shifted from victims to survivors based on the decision to escape. So basically, social views on women in abusive relationships were, okay, you're not a victim, you are a survivor, and you're going to decide to find a better life for yourself, basically. So this little section was kind of interesting to me. Leaving is the coping strategy that has received the most attention. And the truth is that many women do leave. That's not what we hear, that's not the headline, that's never the article, but it is the truth. If you look at research, if you look at studies, battered women do leave. Psychological and behavioral consequences of partner violence. You're going to see post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, lowered self-esteem, really not surprising side effects. If I was going to speculate on what I thought side effects of abusive relationship might be, that's exactly the list I would draw up. And then research shows that women do not generally blame themselves for their partner's violence. That was probably one of the most interesting lines of the article to me, to read that, because I feel like you always hear that, oh, like, she blamed herself, she blames herself, he blamed himself, and then, but if you look at the research, they don't. Women generally do not blame themselves, which, you know, I would never have guessed that without looking at the research. Okay, and then studies have found that more serious physical and psychological consequences exist for women than for men. Okie doke. And then the last group affected by the domestic violence is going to be the children. Sadly, unfortunately, behavioral effects include aggression and delinquency, and then the psychological effects are going to include anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. Just so sad. Very, very sad. Social consequences of partner violence. Effects of battering on women's employment. It's going to cause repeated absences, going to cause impairment of women's physical health, mental agility, and concentration, and lowering self-esteem and aspirations. Again, I want to tie back to the differences in the gender. So when we're looking at effects of battering, I don't want to say victimizing, but these negative effects, we're only looking at the women. Before, when I asked that question about why are we not looking at violence with women, I feel the same thing here. Why are we not talking about psychological and physical effects? Why are we not talking about the effects of, you know, domestic violence on male employment, on guys, on their anything at all? This entire last section was completely about women and some about the children, which I find a little strange, and I'd like to see the research on that. Gender equality, they mentioned that earlier in the article. I don't see that. And then the last thing is just, it talked about how battered women are going to have higher rates of homelessness. So that was the article. Honestly, pretty sad, pretty long, pretty dry, but it did have some interesting information in it, which I highlighted the most interesting points that I found the most interesting. So just to review what my 2 discussion questions are, and I'm going to post them. The first one was, why do you think that we see the most... So the 3 types of male batterers. Why are we looking at male batterers and we're not looking at women batterers? Do we think that women can fall into these 3 categories? Should we have different categories? And then the other question, why do you think that cohabitating couples show such higher rates of domestic violence than both dating couples and married couples? That's all I have for you. Thank you for watching and participating.